Peter Frankopan, your book reflects an almost overwhelming surge of new scholarship in the last few decades about changes in the natural world, whether caused by climate change or things like volcanic eruptions. How profoundly does this scholarship change our view of history?
Well, I think when we think about history, normally we're reading what people did in the past and what they thought they were doing in the past. And what data does, like for any historian, you rely on evidence and sources. And the deluge of new materials around climate science, but also around pathogens. So I think we need to now think about how we think about history in a different way, that it's not just about written text and archaeology and material culture and the art and architecture, but how we integrate sciences into how we think about history.
Why do you think it is that the sorts of environmental changes that you document have not been given much attention by historians in the past? I mean, that there's been this tendency to only see history as a narrative of human will.
I guess part of the reason is that we're always drawn to human stories. We're always drawn to individual rulers, dictators, individuals who've had these colourful stories, and that makes it difficult to see the wood from the trees. I mean, in the same way, I guess there are lots of things that are missing from history. You know, by and large, women haven't appeared until relatively recently in the way historians think about the past. So there are lots of other pockets. I mean, I think that the idea about the environment and how important it is, as you said, Laura, goes right back to the beginning of time. You know, the very first records across almost every single civilization and culture that we can find talk about environmental and ecological crisis as being a form of divine punishment.
Well, climate change skeptics have often said that the climate has always been changing, so there's nothing to see here. But setting aside the current pace of change, your point in the book is that the lesson is that societies, peoples and cultures that have been unable to adapt to these sorts of changes have collapsed.
The key, of course, is adaptation. We've had 5 mass extinctions on this planet before, triggered by things like massive volcanic eruptions, tectonic plate shifts, and a single asteroid that hit in the Yucatan Peninsula in what's now Mexico. And all of those events in the past have led to biodiversity change and climatic change, but all of them have been slower than what is happening now. Our rate of species loss is faster even than when that asteroid hit.
Well, one of the joys of reading your book is that it brings together all these changes in the natural world over the millennia with all sorts of other events, from settlement patterns in earliest days and agricultural output to the rise and fall of empires and, in fact, the development of religion. Can you give us some examples of that?
I guess you can pick lots of signature events. One would be the fall of Queen Cleopatra in 30 BC, where that wasn't caused by volcanic eruptions, but it just so happened that when Julius Caesar was murdered, as his assassins were being hunted down, a major eruption in a volcano in Alaska called Okmok produced a measurable effect on the Nile. And the Nile is the kind of source of the life and the blood of Egypt, fertilizes all the fields. And if that flood fails to happen or is greatly reduced, of course, the amount of produce you grow is much smaller. And that meant that there was a context for Cleopatra to be undermined within her own state. And it just so happened that Cleopatra tried to strengthen her position threw her lot in with one of the generals, Mark Antony, the golden boy of the Roman Republic, and she bet wrong. Octavius manages to track them down, and with Cleopatra and Mark Antony both dying, and the grateful Senate in Rome renames Octavius Augustus, and Rome incorporates Egypt into the to become the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. It's never the single element that changes things, but it allows us, I think, to reintegrate the natural environment, the way in which demographics, energy, food, political decisions are all built into what happens when things introduce levels of vulnerability that make quite big things fail. And that happens regularly in human history.
You argue that climate change is already having significant effects on power relationships. For example, you argue that climatic conditions in the Western Sahel created a power vacuum that we've seen filled by organised crime, terror groups and non-state actors. I mean, that's a really interesting and very contemporary view of the sorts of impacts that people might not think about.
Well, when you have stress of any kind and resource shortage, people turn up to give solutions, and sometimes in the past those are spiritual, religious ones that explain the divine and they gain followings. Sometimes it's political opportunism. Sometimes it's simply trying to join up to a strong leader who is going to allow you access to, in your family, access to food and water. So in Saudi Arabia today, for example, the Saudi government burns about 700,000 barrels of oil per day just to keep the air conditioning on in a country that doesn't have a single river or a single lake. And I think one of the big challenges about the climate crisis we have now is climate, like disease, is always about inequality. And people who are rich can adapt better and have more resilience than those who are poor. And I think we sometimes forget that the world's richest 1% are richer than the bottom 75% of the world's population.
And you ponder the extent in the book to which what you call Russia's past, present and future ecological bonanza has played a strategic role in its decision to invade Ukraine. If we think about the war in Ukraine in those sorts of terms, does it lead us to a different analysis of the outcome?
There are countries and regions that will benefit from a warming world because they'll unlock more agricultural lands, it will become easier and cheaper to build roads when ice packs melt, and Russia is one of the main beneficiaries of a warming world. If you were sitting in Moscow, you'd think that the 21st century probably offers lots of benefits coming towards you, where, already in Europe we have 20% of the European Union lives in water stress. I think it's trying to understand that we are all part of a global ecosystem, and in that sense, the geopolitics and the environmental stuff that I'm doing at the moment does remind us that we are all interconnected into the same Garden of Eden. And if we get that wrong, as we've been taught in our Bibles classes or however you're learning about your religions, if you get it wrong, you get punished. And that's probably quite a good salutary starting point for the world as we are in 2023.
Peter Frankopan, thanks so much for speaking to 7:30.
Thank you very much for having me.